Well, thanks for joining us for the Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN. I'm your host, Peter Sled. Our guest this week is sports writer Jane McManus, who writes the story of the growth in women's sports. That podcast begins in a moment. Well, Jane McManus worked at ESPN for years. In her new book, she says that the best career track for her then was covering men's sports. That's where the viewers and the money were. But that is changing quickly. With the advent of Title IX, the early efforts of women's tennis, led by Billie Jean King and Venus Williams, and through the determination of many other women athletes, viewership, enthusiasm, coverage, and pay equity are growing. Our conversation with Jane McManus about her book, The Fast Track, begins now. Jane McManus, on the cover of your book, The Fast Track Inside the Surging Business of Women's Sports, the cover photos are Caitlin Clark and Coco Gauff. How much decision-making went into who to put on the cover of this book?
Well, that was a conversation that we had, that I had with my publisher and with my editor, about what to do now. I pitched this book back in 2020, so long before Caitlin Clark was on the scene, and it really isn't necessarily about Caitlin Clark, or Coco Gauff for that matter. But I felt like those two women really exemplify what is happening right now in women's sports generally. Caitlin Clark on the vanguard of the WNBA, which is rising very quickly right now, I think, in the national consciousness. And then also, Coco Gauff represents a sport that has been the most successful historically for women in tennis. And so really, they kind of tell a story, their two careers.
You write that to understand women's sports is to be a historian, a sociologist, a sports fan, an athlete, a politician, and a prognosticator. What do you mean?
Well, I just think there's a lot that goes into it. I've been asked, is Caitlin Clark the reason this is happening? Are we having this moment because of her? And really the answer is no. Caitlin Clark is not the catalyst for the moment that we're having. She's the beneficiary, really. Like, she's taking it to the next level. It's a relay race, and the baton gets passed. And luckily, there's a dynamic basketball player there who's ready to take it. But this is an overnight sensation, decades in the making, so to say. There have been many, many moments when women's sports have almost taken off. I'm sure to say, start with the historian part. We have Gertrude Ederle, for example, in the 1920s, swam the English Channel and got a ticker tape parade up Broadway, Canyon of Heroes. There were 2 million people lining that street to see her go up in victory. And I just think, we tend to think of these things as being very modern, but there are lots of things that have happened along the way, where there's been a lot of enthusiasm around women's sports, and it's dissipated, it's faded, or it's literally been made illegal.
Why do you have to be a politician to understand women's sports?
You can't separate out the identity of women and playing sports, the ability to play sports. So, for example, Title IX in 1972 was passed, really to provide equal opportunity at institutions of higher learning in the classroom. But because they used the word activity within the context of that statute, it has also been applied to sports. That's a law, that's literal policy. So when we talk about being a politician, it's very much about opportunities that are tied to the way that women are seen socially. You really can't do something if literally it's illegal to box, and as it was in the UK up until more recently than you might think. It was illegal to run in the Boston Marathon until 1973. The first marathon at the Olympics wasn't until 1984. All of these different things are decisions that have been made along the lines. There are structures in place that have kept women off the starting line for a long time. So that's what I mean by it. It's very much about the way that identity dovetails with expectations. And particularly when it comes to sports and to women, those two things haven't always been in concert. Playing sports was an act of rebellion for a very long time.
Jane McManus, what's your background with sports?
Well, I was born in 1971, and I think that's a big part of my story. It was the year before Title IX. And so I look at the opportunities that I had to play or that my daughters had to play in conjunction kind of with that span of time. I grew up and loved playing, really, and was called a tomboy, was one of the kids in the neighborhood all the time. My first stitches were from tackling somebody's dad in a football game, getting driven to the emergency room on a big wheel. I played a lot of basketball in college, played a lot of pickup. And when I moved to New York City, I played a lot of pickup all over the city, wherever I could catch a game. Played, just for the love of it. Was often the only woman on the court and loved sports and have always done something, whether it's running or being active. But I also played roller derby for 7 years, starting in 2007, kind of the resurgence of roller derby in this country, and loved that. Loved every minute of that. I love full contact sports. I love, whether it's swimming or tennis. I love being active. I love sports. I think there's you either like that kind of thing or you don't. You take to it or you don't. And I've just always been somebody who wanted to play.
And there's an ESPN connection as well.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing is I was always interested in playing, but I didn't realize that you could be a sports writer, that I could be a sports writer. I knew there were sports writers. I just didn't think I could be one of them. And a friend of mine, was rollerblading with her in Prospect Park, and she said, you should be a sports writer. And I said, that's it. And so, went to grad school at Columbia and literally worked my way up as a sports writer and made it to ESPN and covered the Jets, covered the NFL, and was one of the original five columnists at ESPNW in 2010. So I didn't get into sports to cover women's sports necessarily. I got into because I wanted to cover basketball, frankly. But at the same time, to be a woman in the sports business is to be aware of what's happening in the conversation around women in sports and to see that I was subject to some of those same dynamics that I was seeing women's sports subjected to, the same biases, the same reluctance, let's say. But yeah, I spent a good almost a decade at ESPN covering all kinds of sports and having a great time.
Well, Jane McManus, you note in your book, The Fast Track, that covering men's sports, the big sports, was a better career path than covering women's sports, correct?
Yeah, sure. More job security, higher pay, for sure. I mean, when I got into covering sports, it was in 1997 is when I graduated from grad school, and really there were no jobs covering women's sports exclusively that I was aware of. Really, men's sports have always been kind of seen as the varsity. I remember once when I was starting off and I was covering a girls' soccer game for a high school, for a high school sports section, and I had covered a couple of girls' games, and I hadn't been assigned to cover a boys' one. And so I went to my editor and I said, when do you think I'll be covering a boys' game? And my editor said, when you're ready. And what that said to me is that there's a hierarchy of coverage, and boys is above girls. We're paying more attention to boys than we are to girls. And really, that was true, not as much really at the high school level writ large. Most sports sections try to cover both equally. But certainly when you get to college and when you're covering colleges, I would cover a lot of college basketball and suggest sometimes that if there was a double header, for example, the women were playing before a men's basketball team, I'd volunteer to cover both games. And sometimes even if I would volunteer to cover both games, I'd be told there wasn't enough space or, maybe just put the women's game, a paragraph or two about it at the end of the story, stuff like that. So there was definitely a reluctance. I mean, I've advocated for covering more women's sports at every place that I've ever been, whether it's covering the Liberty in New York City or covering the WTA as a beat, particularly when ESPN had all of the majors, the broadcast rights for all of the majors. I thought, wow, that would be a great, natural beat for us to really own and be able to break news on.
Well, you dedicate this book to your rollerblading partner, don't you?
Yeah, I do. I do. Nadja James, she is no longer with us, but she was this incredibly vibrant, insightful person. And we were active when we would get into all kinds of nonsense when I moved to New York City after college. And we did a lot of temp jobs together, which was pretty fun, but we lived really close to each other. And sometimes I think you need that. Think you need somebody who has a different perspective than you to kind of look at you and say, you know what you'd be suited to, and I'll never forget that moment, and it changed the course of my life.
You spend a lot of time with Billie Jean King. What was her role in furthering women's sports?
What didn't she do to further women's sports? She and her partner Alana Kloss have been, I mean, it's hard to really describe the magnitude of what they've done. First of all, Billie Jean King beating Bobby Riggs upended a fundamental assumption at that time in sports, which was that women were always inferior to men, that men were always going to be superior athletically in any context. And Bobby Riggs had beaten Margaret Court in the Mother's Day Massacre, and Billie Jean King rose to the moment and said, "Okay, you want another one? I'll play you." And it was, at the Astrodome with, they were brought in literally on litters, carried on people's backs. And the Astrodome was filled and it was a pomp and spectacle. It was on ABC. I think it's still the largest crowd for a tennis match in the United States. And it was a fundamental moment. It was a fundamental moment of we can do this for women's sports. It propelled the WTA into a place where women can earn a living and have been able to earn a living for a couple of decades now, not as the top player necessarily, but even as a mid-tier player. And that really is really important.
And WTA stands for World's Tennis Association?
Women's Tennis Association.
Tennis Association. Well,
yes.
C-SPAN interviewed Billie Jean King in 2008 about that match. Here's a little bit of what she had to say.
Bobby had asked me to play for about 3 years. I said, no, no, no. Then he went to Chris Everett. And her dad, she wasn't quite 20 in 73. And so Daddy, Jimmy Everett, said, no, you're not going to play him. And when Margaret lost, then I felt I didn't have a choice. So there was a tremendous amount of pressure. I was very scared. I thought that if I lost that match, that's probably going to be the rest of my life. I'd be known as the girl who lost to Bobby Riggs.
Do you think it would have set women's sports back or Title IX back?
Yes, I think it would have hurt a lot, maybe. I don't really know, but I knew if I won, it would help.
Jane McManus, what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, she's always been somebody who recognized her platform. And that's really important. And I think you can hear in what she says there that she's aware, and of course, with the benefit of hindsight, but she's really aware of what that means. And I mean, I love that it's, Margaret Court loses, and so then she's like, "Guess I got to do it." I mean, that's really somebody who's like, "Okay, if it's me, it's me. I'm up, so I'm doing it." And that's really been her approach, not just to that match, but to everything else too. When the women who played in the U.S. women's national team in 1999, we had the World Cup in the United States. And the original venues that were booked for those games were quite small. And some of the women on the team, Mia Hamm and Julie Foudy, wanted to think bigger. And so who did they go to? They went to Billie Jean King to get advice about upping the ante on the stadiums. And so they ended up playing in Giant Stadium in the Rose Bowl and filled the Rose Bowl, which was another seminal moment. And that moment, you wouldn't think had anything to do with Billie Jean King, but it did. It had something to do with Billie Jean King. She's been a consigliere for all of these different leagues as they try to get off the ground, though the women's professional leagues in different sports, because she has such a great understanding of the moment, the opportunity, but also she is really pushed for things to be financially sound. She's seen a lot of things fail. She hates seeing things fail because she knows, you can have the XFL, which is a football league that is not the NFL, and it gets started again and again and again. It fails and it gets started again, and there's kind of this infinite appetite to start the XFL. But for women's sports, a soccer league fails, and it's a big deal. A basketball league fails, and it's a big deal. And it takes time and it takes energy because the assumption is, well, nobody cares about women's sports, which was the mantra for so long. It's not anymore. But at the time, that's what they're fighting against, not just the ability to get those leagues up and started, but to quash the reluctance around women's sports generally.
Well, for those of us of a certain age, we remember the Virginia Slims tennis tournaments. What was that about?
Well, Philip Morris, the tobacco company, was really the only big sponsor that that young WTA had in the early 70s to get started. Philip Morris was trying to capitalize with Virginia Slims on the enthusiasm around the women's movement and women's liberation and kind of market a cigarette to those who wanted to see themselves as part of it. And so, there was a lot of debate at that time about whether or not it really was fitting for a women's professional tour and a group of athletes to promote cigarettes as part of their genesis. And at the same time, Billy very practically said, well, if we don't do this, we don't have money coming from other areas. We won't get the prize money. The whole reason they launched it, the WTA to begin with, was the fact that there was such unequal prize money across the board for players in the women's game versus players in the men's game. And so they ended up taking that offer for Virginia Slims and launched the tour with it. I mean, I think there are a lot of players and later on, part of the reason that they ended up choosing to go with other companies and other brands was really just the real feelings about how that really hadn't been a great company to go with at the beginning.
You write in your book that the elder of the two Williams sisters, Venus, who dominated tennis, does not get the credit she deserves for the advocacy behind the scenes of the Women's Tennis Association that finally attained equal pay for the members of the women's Grand Slam events. This was in 2006, Jane McManus.
Yeah, it's hard. This is the thing about history. We all have the memory of mayflies. We are forgetting everything constantly. Um, but Venus was very instrumental in getting that fourth major, Wimbledon, to finally offer equal prize money in 2007, and that was the last one to do it. The U.S. Open was 1973. The Australian followed suit. Then the Australian backtracked in 1996 and then went back to equal pay. The French Open in 2006, but Wimbledon didn't want to do it. And the margin between what they paid the men and what they paid the women was very small. The difference was small, but it was still a point. It was making a point, that difference was that the women were not as good. And so Venus wrote an op-ed in the Times of London. And, Venus had won the Wimbledon a number of times at that point. She also really connects with the fan base here in London. I think, every great champion kind of has places where they just seem to fit and find, like for Serena, it's Paris, but for Venus, it was always London. And so she writes this really important op-ed that calls to attention that that Wimbledon is doing this and making this point over something as small as the cost of the begonias on the grounds, and really shames the organizers for not providing equal pay and being so reluctant to provide equal pay. And I think coming from another player or just grousing, it wouldn't have meant the same thing. But because it was Venus and because it was Wimbledon and because she was so beloved here, it really made a difference. And the next year, and voices spoke up and it got sorted very quickly. And the next thing you know, all of the Grand Slams finally had equal pay.
Jane McManus, can you make an economic argument that, well, the men earned more money, more viewership, more seats, more people in the stands, etc.?
In tennis?
Or in any sport?
Well, I think you have to go sport by sport because they're all different. The way that revenue is generated is different. But I'll say for tennis, people don't buy a ticket to a match until the very end of a tournament. They buy a ticket to a day. And so you buy a day ticket or a night ticket at a Grand Slam event. The media is there, the fans are there, the sponsors are there, and they're not necessarily there for men or for women. They're there for the tennis, for the best tennis in the world. And so for tennis, you really, I don't think you can make that economic argument. If you look at the ratings, for example, there have been times that the women's final, particularly in the United States, less so in the rest of the world, where I think there is more interest in men's tennis, but certainly in the United States, you can have the women's final outrate the men's final on television. So there's really difficult to disentangle, who's doing what for the men's or for the women's. And it's a really margin, it's in the margins. That is a sport where there really is equity, particularly at the Grand Slams. There are, I mean, we could go down the line sport by sport. I don't want to drag this conversation though into, and now we go to volleyball, But there are, each sport has its own kind of financial model. Revenue, player salaries are a percentage of revenue in team sports. They're collectively bargained between the leagues and the players. So each one kind of is a bit of a unique story unto itself. I think though, when you look at, say, for example, the NCAA, and you look at Grand Slam tennis, and you look at US soccer, all three of those are entities where men's and women's events are under the same umbrella. And they're all leagues that have treated things quite differently. And I think with US soccer, for example, now the men and women are treated equitably, but it took a lawsuit, it took fan outrage and chance of equal pay across the country and in France as they won the World Cup in 2019. And it also took the men and the US men's soccer team, those players, to come back to the table to collectively bargain so that the women could have equal pay. If the men hadn't made that concession and agreed to do that, the women wouldn't have equal pay today.
Well, let's go talk about the 99ers, the women's soccer team.
Well, they were, I mean, they were this incredibly genial group of women. You have to realize also, I think, that World Cup soccer, they'd only had a women's World Cup since 1991, I believe is the date. So very recent. So 99, things were just kind of getting started. And I think the US got the tournament that year pretty late as a site. So they were kind of scrambling to get things together. But those players were super popular in this country. People knew who they were. It was kind of the beginning of soccer's real kind of popularity. There was an explosion of play in addition to this team that just kept winning on the world stage. This was the first generation after Title IX. So you had women who were coming of age, having really been encouraged to play and having the opportunity to play their entire lives. And, that's a real difference. And then at the same time, you have the rest of the world really hadn't caught up yet to having girls be able to play in those same numbers. So even in Western Europe, for example, you didn't have the same sort of push for play. You also don't have in other parts of the country or the other parts of the world, you don't have teams associated with universities. And with Title IX and the opportunity for those players many of them from North Carolina, to play at the college level, that's, just reinforcing that kind of excellence and, honing those skills even further. And so by the time they get to the World Cup stage, Mia Hamm and Julie Foudy are practically household names. And then they get there, they play. Brandi Chastain, in a moment of celebration, strips off her shirt and screams in victory. And that photo is taken, and it goes across every newspaper, on the cover of Sports Illustrated, et cetera. Just this moment of celebration of this victory. And it was something that everybody could kind of get behind. That was on the heels also of the 96 Olympics where the women had won gold in soccer as well. So you really just had this moment and this culmination, and it ended up kind of coalescing between 96 and the victories in Atlanta at the Atlanta Olympics, where 4 US women won team gold, to also then the 99ers at the Rose Bowl winning the World Cup. That really consolidated that second wave, I think, of in my lifetime of a huge popularity in women's sports.
What's the importance of the Olympics to women's sports?
Yeah, you wouldn't have, it's really the first place where women were able to play on a big stage like that, and where, it was about national pride. So it's not just about, men's and women's, but it's also this idea of national pride. And all of these different events, I mean, the thing about the Olympics, it's almost unimaginable how you put together something like that and put it on. But you have women competing in so many different events. And so you have so much opportunity for gold. And again, with the US being, having a leg up, the US women having a leg up because of Title IX and being able to, play at the collegiate level. You just have like you've had really strong American competitors. It's another place like Grand Slams where the media is already there. So the architecture for promotion and support in sponsorships, and in the ability to put something on and then having the media, it's already there for men and women's sports. So if somebody's there because like, oh, well, we've got to see, how the men do in skiing, but then there's this incredibly great story on the women's side, even back in the day, writers would cover it because it would be about the story and the story would be undeniable. And so you would have a lot of care for that. And then also, you've had the ability for, um, gymnastics and figure skating were two of kind of the big Olympic sports when I was a kid. And, those are very traditional sports where women have always been able to compete and do well because, in part because it's an individual sport and women playing individual sports have had ability to kind of rise above a little bit more easily. But also, the way they're presented is very in concert with the ideas of what femininity was at that time. And so because of that, you didn't necessarily have people say, oh, well, I don't want to watch, women play sports, which is something that team sports really struggled against for a long time. But in those individual sports, and particularly those feminine presenting sports, which were at the Olympics, it was a real opportunity for those athletes to shine. And it kind of was a kind of way of looking in and kind of seeing the future a little bit and appreciating the excellence and the artistry that those athletes had.
Well, back to the historian part of understanding women's sports, you write that you cannot understand the opposition women have faced as athletes until you look at the way women's bodies have been treated and why choosing to play professional sports has been a radical act. What do you mean?
Yeah, well, so back in the late 1800s, there was a German medical journal that reported that, if women competed and overexerted themselves in sports, they could damage their ability to reproduce. And this is something actually that goes back much farther to even, Aristotle and the way that women were looked at when in the early days of Western philosophy and the idea of sorting people into different groups. And women were always seen as less than, and the idea that, women could be damaged if they exerted themselves became quite prevalent. And, it's the reason that when James Naismith invented basketball in the late 1800s, and one of the first games was played at Smith, the court was divided into three zones, and athletes weren't able to run between those zones. They had to stay in their zone. And this was to kind of maintain this idea that their delicacy wouldn't be damaged by this sport by putting them in different zones. And that's also why, Catherine Switzer, when she ran the Boston Marathon in 1967, had to register under her initial because women weren't allowed to run. But it wasn't just that she wasn't allowed to run; it's that there weren't any structures in place for her to run, and that goes back, to these ideas of delicacy. And so certain sports have always been kind of okay or less frowned upon than other sports because of this idea of delicacy, and those are the ones that then um don't where women don't have to sweat. And so tennis, of course, was something where you could look at and say, oh, okay, well, that's not so bad. But you look back at the clothes that women had to wear back at that time in the late 1800s, and it was corsets and the restrictions, and you couldn't run in that sort of thing anyway. You really would pass out, because it doesn't allow you to be able to breathe. It's not a performance fabric. So all of these things kind of were in the air and really, I'm thinking back now to Ed Simple's Tiger Bells, which was Tennessee State had this track and field team, and they were called the Tiger Bells, and they were excellent. Um, Wilma Rudolph was one of them and won gold in Rome in 1960. But the coach would have a mantra, which was that the women on the team, after they won something, before they talked to the media, they had to put on lipstick and do their hair. And his mantra was, foxes, not oxes. And, I'm sure that he thought he was looking out for those players, and dealing with the mores of the time in the 1950s and 60s, but particularly for Black women, this idea of, being athletes was quite fraught, and because of the expectations around race and gender at the time. And he just knew that if they were not seen as women first, that they could run into trouble socially. And I just think of all of these different ways that women had to try to fit into these really narrow constrictions and ideas of what being an athlete was, and never really approach being an athlete, but always kind of like be a step away from it because of the societal expectations of women at the time, which again was not that you could go on and earn a living in being an athlete or even in the workplace, but that you would go on and be a mother. And so anything that you did as a younger woman that would impede your ability to be a mother was absolutely verboten.
Well, it's not all progress, Jane McManus. It was in this century that Ian Cohen said to Eugenie Bouchard at the Australian Open, "Give us a twirl and tell us about your outfit."
Yeah, it kind of speaks for itself, doesn't it? I mean, again, very well. I mean, you don't have to look far to see those kinds of things. The attitudes are still very much out there. They haven't gone away necessarily. I mean, you like to think so, and I actually do think that today's athletes are doing a lot with with their ability to perform, and just their excellence to be able to dispel some of that stuff, but it still comes back again and again. And I would be surprised if that went away entirely. But what you do have now are women who see themselves as athletes first, and they aren't looking to be pleasing to anyone else. And I think that is where things have changed quite a bit. Today's athletes see sports as their birthright, not just their brothers. And I think, honestly, their brothers would say the same thing for the most part.
The year is 2023. Spain women had just won the World Cup. One of the players was Jennifer Hermoso. What happened?
Yeah, she was celebrating, and her coach, Luis Rubiales, as he went down to congratulate each of the players in turn, kissed her without her consent, and hugged her. He was clearly celebrating and thought that this was his moment, but it was not his moment, it was hers. And I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of who is celebrating and who gets to celebrate in that moment. And it's not that someone who's celebrating, a man who is celebrating, can just do whatever he likes. It really was, it was inappropriate. And it kind of, not only did it take away the joy from her in that moment, but then the discussion became about the kiss, and it became around that, as opposed to allowing her to really celebrate and take a victory lap. And it became something that was fraught and unpleasant, as opposed to her being able to have and celebrate her moment.
Were there consequences for the coach?
Not at first. At first, the Spanish Soccer Federation completely backed him, and he was cheered even in one setting. There were horrible things that were said about Hermoso, unfair things that were said about her because she was making a problem for them by being forthright about what she had not said yes to. And yeah, so she was seen as the problem, and they tried to rally the troops. But ultimately, what happened is the rest of the world spoke up, and other players, actually men who played, spoke up on Jenny's behalf. And ultimately, what happened was that he was forced to step back and to apologize. And I believe even there were some legal repercussions for him as well. But it is something that's very different because I think, 30 years ago, she would have been told to laugh it off, or that it wasn't important, or she shouldn't be making a big deal out of it, or anything like that. Like, to just there her and allow him to do whatever he likes. But we're in a new age, and I think that women who play sports kind of recognize their own bodily autonomy, and they kind of know what their boundaries are, and they understand their power in a way that's different from generations before, which is probably why there are people who don't necessarily want women to be playing sports, because it really is a place where you start to understand yourself better, you understand your power and your autonomy.
Back to your book, The Fast Track, you write, issues that affect the politics of women's bodies, whether around reproduction, consent, identity, value, or desire, affect women's sports. The rigidity of categorization reinforces the gender binary, and for athletes who choose to play in the women's category, competing is a historically rebellious act. What are you telling us?
Well, it's important to understand this context, because so much of the pushback that athletes do get when they speak out comes because of expectations of what is your place. I think we've seen that not just in women's sports, but in sports writ large. Colin Kaepernick, and the moment that he spoke up, was deeply divisive because of ideas about him and what his place is. And I think that the same can happen with women in sports, particularly women of color, who I face often larger hurdles than white women do. And also that's reflected in endorsements and name, image, and likeness opportunities, and anything else. Just like in society, right? Those things happen in society, and so they happen in sports too. And I just think, I think it's really important. Fan bases in men's sports don't necessarily have to make those calculations when they're deciding who to support. But I think what we've seen is that fan bases around women's sports actually understand that, and there's some sophistication there, because when women in sports have decided to take up a cause, and I'm thinking particularly of the WNBA, in the bubble, and during the COVID year when they played, they came together and made a very strong statement against one of the owners of the Atlanta Dream, Kelly Loeffler, as she was running for an open Senate seat against Raphael Warnock. And the players on the Atlanta Dream came out in Warnock shirts for a practice one game. And, this was, really forthright campaign, a very visible campaign, and very unusual to have players come out and not support a candidate who was affiliated with the league. But Kelly Loeffler had come out against Black Lives Matters. And so those players took it very seriously. And rather than drive back an audience or push away an audience, the WNBA became more popular. And now every single year it takes on a cause, like, for example, whether voting rights or maternal health, because the maternal health disparities end up, really hurting mothers of color. It's pretty atrocious. And so bringing attention to those issues is something that the women of the WNBA have decided to do, and the players in the WNBA have decided to do. And I think that it's important to understand the context around it. And I think the reason it doesn't drive off those fans is because they also understand that context.
I want to show a little video of former NCAA swimmer Riley Gaines talking about competing. Here's what she had to say.
I can wholeheartedly attest to the tears that I saw, not just from the moms in the stands watching as their daughters are being obliterated in the sport that they once loved, but the tears from the girls who placed 9th and 17th and missed out on being named an All-American by one place. And I can wholeheartedly attest to the whispers, because that's what they were. They were whispers of anger and frustration from those girls who, just like myself, had worked our entire lives to get to this meet. And so that first day he swam the 500 freestyle, which is not an event that I do. And so I watched on the side of the pool as he swam to a national title, to literally no one's surprise, beating out Olympians, beating out American record holders. Keep in mind, these aren't scrubs. No, they're the most impressive and accomplished female swimmers this world has ever seen, and he beat them all by body lengths.
That was Riley Gaines talking about competing against Leah Thomas. Jane McManus?
Well, I mean, obviously she is, has really been hurt by this, and she's speaking out about it. Um, I think it's a much bigger issue though than just those two people. And I've never competed at a high level in swimming or roller derby or basketball, but I have actually competed in recreational sports, and I've competed in a lot of co-ed sports. And I played against trans players when I played roller derby, which is a full contact sport. Um, and there was an inclusive policy for trans players in 2010, back when I was playing. And just personally, again, it's a team sport. But she speaks to her experience. I'll speak to my experience. I never had an issue playing against trans players. So my concern is that the opportunities for play will be denied people because at the very top level for some sports individually, um, those rules ultimately get sewn back down to the grassroots level. And I don't know that that makes sense in every case because there are a lot of times when inclusive play is fine. I mean, I played basketball against men for, a lot of my, for a lot of my 20s. And I would just really hate if it became this idea that, well, women aren't safe playing against male bodies and that we need to make sure that we're insulated from that because then that's going to cut off a lot of opportunities for inclusive play. And I think, so for me, I don't necessarily know what the right call is for the last heat of the Olympics, but I can tell you that I don't think the rules that apply there need to apply everywhere else, and that the idea of community in sports and team play and the great things that come from playing together, and playing co-ed sports too. I don't want us to get into a conversation where we start thinking that everything has to be stratified and women have to be protected and, can't, manage any contact or compete in, or be made to feel uncomfortable.
Jane McManus, what do you think about the surging popularity of pickleball for both men and women? Most of it played co-ed.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like different sports become popular at different times. Think of tennis in the 70s. Really things can catch fire. My husband is he loves tennis and he plays all the time. So if I talk too much about pickleball, I just have to be worried personally that, I might, I don't want to disrupt anything at home. But it's a really fun sport, and I think anything that can get you out there and get you moving, introduce you to new people, get you community. Those are all great things, and I think pickleball is something that's certainly catching fire. The problem is, of course, when you turn tennis courts into pickleball courts, there are some tennis players who can get a little get a little flustered.
Well, I want to go back to tennis a little bit. We talked about Billie Jean King, but then Chris Everett, Martina Navratilova came along and furthered that game on the women's side. But then the Williams sisters, they kind of amplified everything, didn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, talk about certainly at the beginning of their careers, a political conversation that's happening side by side with their tennis. They were booed at a tournament in Miami, because there were rumors about their father orchestrating who would win what match when they played against each other. And when they did play against each other, those matches were not comfortable. And sometimes they weren't all that competitive. It was clear they didn't really like playing against each other. Whatever athletic psyching out they have to do in order to able to get ready to play at a high level. They really had a hard time doing that against each other. Certainly Venus had a hard time doing it against Serena. So in some ways it was a bit of I don't know, it was a bit tough to watch. But yeah, they both, Richard Williams was very smart in that he saw that, women's tennis players could make real money. And boy, did they both end up making real money. I think you see the investment that Serena's doing today, and it really is, kind of paradigm busting what she's been able to do, with raising profiles of other different sports, investing in Angel City, which is an NWSL team, and lots of other things. But, they were fun to watch. They were very different. They were very different kinds of players. I think they both broke barriers in lots of different ways. They changed the way that US women's tennis looks. And what I mean by that is that if you look at their influence in extending the USTA's influence with grassroots programs and getting more resources to those grassroots programs. You know, there are generations of players now who started playing tennis because of Venus and Serena, and they don't look like the same players who were playing when Venus and Serena got into the game. You have women of color who, like Coco Gauff, like Madison Keys, who are, you know, absolutely the legacy of those Williams sisters. And the same did not happen in golf with Tiger Woods. We don't have that exact same um, phenomenon that happened afterwards. So it really is about what they did, Venus and Serena, when they were part of the tour and what they advocated for behind the scenes, et cetera. But tennis is a very different place now because of what they've done. And they've upped the ante for women, and they've upped the ability for women to make money, you know, in the sport, not just from the prize money, but then also endorsements. And then also Serena really changed the way that people think about what you can do after you become a mother. And Kim Clijsters also, you know, kind of opened the door on that as well. But it's this idea that, you know, tennis is a very different place. It used to be when they came into the game, you would, if you were a woman, you'd probably be retiring around the age of 27. You'd certainly be retiring before you had kids. And if you did get pregnant, that was probably the end of your career. And instead of that, they left at a place where women are playing, you know, into their 40s, and where you can have a child and come back, and you know it might be more challenging, and you might have to do more to try to get back to where you were, but it's certainly possible. And also, especially with Venus, you know, she doesn't have to win every tournament anymore. Like she doesn't have to win every tournament in order to be, you know, one of the best out there. She's able to write her own ticket for how long she wants to play and what it means to her to play. And again, it's hard to overstate how different that is from the conditions that they found when they started playing.
Jane McManus, at their height, did Venus and Serena make more on the circuit or more in endorsements?
I believe they made more in endorsements, but they made an incredible, I think, oh gosh, I don't want to throw out the number, but I think it's 96 million for Serena in prize money. But you know, they're still making money in endorsements. So I would say more.
Has that changed for women over the years, the endorsements, and are they important?
The endorsements are crucial for women, particularly women who aren't playing professional tennis. Professional tennis, again, is the only sport for women where the prize money allows you to have a good quality professional level sport career. And there, up until now, have not been other sports where that's necessarily the case, professional leagues where that's necessarily the case. So Wasserman Collective, Wasserman is an agency that represents a lot of men and women, and they put out some data a couple of years ago on this very topic. And what they found is that out of an annual earnings for an athlete in women's sports, about 82% of that comes from endorsements, and the rest, the smaller chunk, comes from prize money. And so it's actually, prize money is not the way that people are making, or salaries is not the way that people are making a living in professional women's sports. It is an endorsement. It's way more crucial that women get those endorsements, because honestly, the revenue for most of the leagues is not at a place yet where those salaries are going to be a wage that it's a living wage, but it's a subsistence level wage.
And Caitlin Clark, again, more in endorsements than her pay from the WNBA?
Well, yes, and I think the WNBA is trying to pay her as much as it can, but you know, it can't
But we're talking six figures at that point, right?
Right,
Not
exactly.
10 million, 20 million like a star in the NBA would get.
Correct. But she's, you know, so she's earning more off the court, but at the same time, her presence is going to raise that, you know, the level of the water for everybody. She is the rising tide, and with Angel Reese as well. I think that rivalry is a big part of her appeal. But that's, you know, that's raising the boats for everybody. And so, you know, Megan Rapinoe, who when U.S. women's national team was fighting with U.S. soccer for a better equity, she said she was at the end of her career. She had maybe 2, 3 years left, and she knew it. And she said, you know, we are not going to see the money that we're fighting for. She said, the next generation is going to get it. And I hope that when those players get it, they take me out to dinner. But, she knew that the fight was not about what her own pocket was going to be filled with. And I think that's probably the case in some ways, even for Caitlin. But it certainly was the case for all of the players before Caitlin. And again, the reason that you have a platform like that for Caitlin to walk into is because of all the work that was done, particularly at the NCAA level after Sedona Prince posted a viral video that showed literally the inequity of the weight room in the women's bubble during the COVID year and the weight room, which was a palace, in the men's bubble. So, again, had that video not gone viral, had the NCAA not launched an investigation into gender equity that found that it had overlooked and left money on the table for the women's tournament for decades. Had Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark not come along the year after that to ESPN trying to do a better job of platforming its own programming, because it had the broadcast rights for the NCAA women's tournament for years. If all of that hadn't happened, then Caitlin Clark wouldn't be walking into a place where she could make that kind of a difference.
Has the name, image, likeness, NIL helped women at the college level?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely it's helped, because it's, they are also able to go out and get their deals and sponsorships as well.
Jane McManus, you have a section in your book called The Gatekeepers. Who are they?
Oh, well, I mean, there have been gatekeepers at different levels, throughout history. But in terms of the media and broadcasting, it's definitely been broadcasters. Having been at ESPN, and ESPN is a fantastic place to work and has done more to promote and elevate women in sports than any other network. But it's also done some things that have ended up holding sports back, women's sports back, and the platforming of women's sports back, just because it's so large. There's the best, you can find the examples of the very best, and examples of some pretty damaging stuff. And I think, a lot of it has to do with the advertising model. However, what ends up happening is that decisions are made where, there's an enthusiasm and an emotional engagement with men's sports for a lot of the men who've worked at networks like ESPN over the years. And it hasn't always been there for women's sports. It just hasn't. And so, you don't necessarily get the same kind of investment. You don't get the same kind of resources. You don't get the same sort of platforming. Bumper programming around women's sports has not been there in the same way, and still isn't, unfortunately. I'm hopeful that will change as well. But and ESPN has done far better than most other networks in that regard too. So I say that with that caveat.
Yeah, you helped to found, didn't you, ESPNW?
Well, Laura Gentili, she was the VP at ESPN at that time, who really was that was her brainchild, and she pushed it. And I was lucky enough to be in that first iteration in 2010. And absolutely, and I had a sports radio talk show with Kate Fagan and Sarah Spain called The Trifecta for 3 years, where we did our best to talk about as many women's sports as we possibly could. And we also ended up, we did a lot of shows. Jamel Hill and Michael Smith had his and hers. And what was so great about that was it meant that every time Jamel was somewhere else, there had to be a different hers filling in. So whether it was Anita Marks or Sarah Spain or myself or Kate Fagan, we were in the rotation on a lot of those shows. And we did the first ever all women's sports center, and the first, not sports center, the first all women's first take, the first all women's sports reporters, and a couple other shows like that. And at the same time, we were really told and encouraged when we were doing those shows to maybe pick a topic around women's sports, or maybe two, but not more than that. We really needed to stick to the same topics that all of the other shows were discussing, because we didn't want to alienate the audience by talking too much about women's sports.
Now, let's talk about football, the biggest sport in America. The formula: 2 male commentators in the booth and a female reporter on the sidelines. What do you think about that?
I mean, it's absolutely formulaic. it's disappointing to me. I do think you see like Mina Kimes, for example, an analyst at ESPN uh, who covers football, and she really proves that you don't. It doesn't matter what your gender is or how you're identifying or anything like that. People who can analyze the NFL can analyze the NFL. Um, it's not rocket science, as they say. But yeah, I mean, a football broadcast is really designed to make men feel comfortable. And in almost half of the audience is now women. But, even just the register of the voices that are calling the game, usually they're very deep. And that you could probably hear three or four different play-by-play announcers, and you might recognize the voice, but you would definitely notice the similarity of the tone and the engagement. It's a lot of talk about how tough guys are, and it's a real pageant in some ways. It's very formulaic. I think actually that's probably why the Manning cast, where Eli and Peyton Manning are, on another channel in ESPN for Monday Night Football, and just talking about the game in a different way is so refreshing, because the way that a football game is broadcast is so formulaic. But yeah, very much gendered as well, and I also think about, the way that over the years producers have panned to different women in the audience, and lingered, and then announcers have said things about those women in a way you just wouldn't about men. And it's very much because this idea that your viewer is a man, and I know that women do feel excluded from that when everything is produced, and all of the visual and the audio cues are telling you that you are not the intended audience. There are other ways to produce games, and I think particularly for women's sports, finding those new ways of broadcasting things, those new ways of including a different kind of audience, is part of the goal.
Well, we've spent the past hour talking about women's sports, but I think I got the stat right from your book that only 5% of sports coverage is focused on women's sports.
Well, that was the last time that reading was done was 2019. And that's Cheryl Cookie out of Purdue and Professor Michael Mesner. They've worked together on that for the last 2 decades, that research. And the number really hasn't budged all that much, between 4 and 5%. It's probably starting to inch up a bit more now. There have been other entities that have tried to do that, put that study together. But I think the traditional media, when you're looking at, sports broadcast, or you're looking at like an ESPN Sports Center or something like that, the number is still probably between 7 and 8% now, not much higher. But it's heading in a different direction for the time being. So I think that is, there are a lot more ways now to get your news, ways to get your sports, ways to get your broadcasts. So it doesn't necessarily, it's not a one-to-one anymore, just because the media universe has so fragmented.
Well, let's go back to where we started. In your book, The Fast Track, Inside the Surging Business of Women's Sports. Jane McManus, you said at the beginning of this conversation that you pitched this book in 2020. It's just been published. Did it mature and change over those 4 or so years?
No, it took that much time to convince a publisher to do it. I got a lot of reluctance around this. Some publishers were thinking, well, can you just do like a story about one plucky athlete who broke that through the ceiling? And I really didn't want to do that, because this is a story about more than just one woman's story. It's a story of all of the women who didn't break through the glass ceiling, who were denied the opportunities, and how their story is just as important as those who are able to emerge now and have the platform. I just don't want those stories to be forgotten, and for people to be lulled into a sense of the inevitability of women's sports and the rise of women's sports. It's not inevitable. And there are, like you noted, there are plenty of people who still have pretty retrograde ideas about women in sports. And so, I think it's important for, those women in the relay who are taking that baton and running on, for them to be aware of the history.
The Fast Track is the name of the book, Inside the Surging Business of Women's Sports. The author, Jane McManus, we appreciate you spending an hour with us here on C-SPAN.
Happy to do it. Thanks for those great questions.
Well, thanks for listening to this week's Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN. Now, if you like this podcast, tell your friends, rate and review us, and follow us on social media at BookTV for more updates and schedule information. And are you looking for more of C-SPAN's book programming? Follow our Bookshelf podcast feed, your one-stop source for Afterwards, Book Notes Plus, and Q&A podcasts. Discover compelling conversations with authors, historians, and thought leaders all in one place. Subscribe to C-SPAN's Bookshelf podcast today. Now, next week on Q&A, our guest is Kathleen Dulaski, who asks a question, who needs college anymore?